Hello and welcome to Dot on the Iron Spaceship, a podcast about science fiction and writing. I'm Bob and this is episode 14. I was going to talk about the trope that only the chosen one can save us, but instead I'm going to put that on the back burner for a week because of the news that's come out in the last week or so about Bob Iger's memoir, specifically how George Lucas reacted when he was told that Disney was not going to go with George Lucas's outlines for the new Star Wars movies. This got me thinking about selling rights and options of intellectual property, and I just thought that I'd say my piece about it. But before we get to that, let's quickly do the weekly roundup. Last week I wrote a blog post about not doing too much too fast. On Tuesday I wrote a free flash fiction story called Spaceship, where humans find an alien ship that's about to crash into Jupiter. I did a review of a Netflix movie called In the Shadow of the Moon, and my Patreon exclusive flash fiction was called The Rookie, another addition to the Frank Mason adventures. Next week there'll be a blog, a free story, a review, a Patreon exclusive, and a podcast, so keep your eyes and ears peeled. This week has been pretty slack, to be honest. I've got the bare minimum done, and I just wanted to keep up with it. I had a couple of days sick. I wanted to spend a lot of time doing writing, but instead I just sat around watching a new TV show called The Rookie. I probably shouldn't expect to do much work when I'm actually sick. It's pretty hard to be creative and be drained at the same time, but my ambition knows no bounds. That said, the two stories that I wrote this week, which is Spaceship and The Rookie. Spaceship was 877 words, and The Rookie was 987 words, and I'm trying to go, with the flash fiction, I'm trying to get around 500 words, so I basically wrote 4 this week. So I kind of overdid it, but the stories, I think it's a good result. I think the stories filled out a bit better. I don't know that I could have cut them down. So even though I didn't feel like I did that much this week, it's clearly evident that I did actually do a fair amount of writing. I think my review for In the Shadow of the Moon is pretty long too, let me check. Okay, 524 words for the review and 512 words for the blog post at the start of the week. So I wrote just shy of 3,000 words this week, and that's pretty good. That's probably why I felt so drained, to be honest, because they were big endeavours, I suppose. So I do need to stretch to be able to writing more each week. But I still have to go to work and do things, and I'm allowed to feel tired and drained sometimes, so other than that, I'm still chasing up on a graphic artist. I need to call some people during the day, which is not so easy for me because I'm not usually awake during business hours. The joys of working permanent night shift, but I will make a concerted effort to get onto it this week and make some phone calls and try and chase it up. That's all I got up to this week. For right now, it's time to thank my patrons. I just want to say a big thank you to all of the people that have supported me in the past or are supporting me on Patreon. If you sign up to my Patreon, you get access, for even just $1 a month, you get access to 16 exclusive Patreon stories with a new one added each week. You automatically be added onto my heraldic list of awesome, which is a page on my website that shows how much I appreciate people who are helping me to do writing and be able to afford to spend time on it. The King of Awesome this week is no surprise. The King of Awesome hasn't changed since I started doing the King of Awesome. It is still Zevin Art, but he can be knocked off of his perch. He's not that far in the lead that someone new coming in might be able to take the crown off of him. So thank you to those guys who have helped me out. Cheers to everyone who has spread the word and told someone about my work and got me a few more followers or viewers or listeners. So that gets us into the main topic for this week, which is there was a book published last week by Bob Iger called, I don't know, something really facetious. My time, 15 things that I learnt being CEO of Disney and how awesome I am or something. And in that, one small part talks about how George Lucas wasn't super happy when he found out that new Disney Star Wars was taking a different direction than what George Lucas had planned. So Iger talks about the fact that when Disney purchased Star Wars from George Lucas, he had written outlines to 3 new movies, and that when Disney acquired Lucasfilm in 2012, they'd also purchased these outlines. And Bob Iger says in quote, "We decided we needed to buy them, though we made clear in the purchase agreement that we would not be contractually obligated to adhere to the plot lines that he'd laid out." It turns out that after they brought in J.J. Abrams, that Disney Star Wars decided they were going to go with entirely different outlines than the ones that George Lucas had written. Which, as a fan, is devastating to find out, because for me, I gave Force Awakens a lot of slack. I said, Disney had to prove that they were going to do a Star Wars movie, and they were going to, they needed to prove that they could make the vision, and I mean, it's going to come up when I go through the rest of the quotes, but Bob Iger talks about, wanting to make sure that it was visually and thematically close to what had gone before, and doing that on purpose. And that's what I got out of that movie, that's what it was. It was proving that Disney could make basically the original, it was basically a remake of the first Star Wars. But if they had plot lines that were written by George Lucas and then decided not to follow them, where we could have had storylines that, continue on with where Luke and Leia and Han and Chewie and Admiral Akbar, oh my god, Admiral Akbar, then it feels like a betrayal to not make the movies that were set out to be the next movies that George wanted to make to further his universe on. And I mean, if you made those movies and then beyond that you went back and made Solo and made these other, the Kenobi movie that they wanted to make and are now turning into a TV show, and The Mandalorian, which is hopefully coming out. I think that's next week. I'm really hoping that The Mandalorian will be good. I hope this with all of the new Disney Star Wars. I hope that it will be good, and then I tend to be incredibly disappointed when it actually comes out. Anyway, I'm getting distracted, which is a common theme on this podcast, but Bob Iger goes on to say that when J.J. Abrams and Michael Arndt met with Lucas to tell Lucas about the new Force Awakens movie, that Lucas wasn't particularly happy. Iger writes, quote, "George immediately got upset as they began to describe the plot, and it dawned on him that they weren't using one of the stories he submitted during the negotiations. George knew we weren't contractually bound to anything, but he thought that our buying the story treatments was a tacit promise that we'd follow them, and he was disappointed that his story was being discarded. I'd been so careful since our first conversation not to mislead him in any way, and I don't think that I had now, but I could have handled it better." He continued, "George felt betrayed, and while this whole process never would have been easy for him, we'd gotten off on an unnecessarily rocky start." When George after George had seen they did a private screening of The Force Awakens for him, Iger recalls that George, quote, "didn't hide his disappointment. There's nothing new," he said. "In each of the films in the original trilogy, it was important to him to present new worlds, new stories, new characters, and new technologies. In this one," he said, "there weren't enough visual or technical leaps forward. He wasn't wrong, but he also wasn't appreciating the pressure we were under to give ardent fans a film we quintessentially felt was Star Wars. We'd intentionally created a world that was visually and tonally connected to the earlier films, to not stray too far from what people loved and expected, and George was criticizing us for the very thing we were trying to do." This is what I was saying earlier. Up until I found out about this book and this quote from Bob Iger, I had been giving Disney a pass because this is what I thought that they had been doing on purpose too. That they had been trying to build something which was thematically the same as Star Wars as a platform to build on. But that was under the assumption that there wasn't a George Lucas story out there in the ether. I mean, I really, really want to read what would have happened in George Lucas's version, and I hope that one day it comes out, because I'm sure it will be better than what we got. Where in The Last Jedi, I was broken from the story in that The Last Jedi breaks from canon so much. That's where the Star Wars' suspension of disbelief was broken for me. But now to find out that it was actually The Force Awakens that broke the canon on purpose. I mean, the story questions and characters that JJ has introduced from the quote that Bob Iger has put in his book, you can heavily infer, since, you know, the quote that is that none of the stories that Lucas put forward were being used, that we can assume that the story that's being told is a huge deviation. So the setups that are set up in The Force Awakens about Snoke, Rey, or like just all of the characters, we don't know what if any of those characters were used from George's treatises. We don't know if they're all creations of JJ, and we don't know what we were supposed to get, but what we did get wasn't very good. I don't think it's necessarily a bad idea to have tried to make the first movie thematically look like Star Wars, or visually to look like Star Wars. I think there is a visual aesthetic that they needed to be going for. But if you've got a story that continues on the universe to work with from the creator, I feel like, even though he's very clear legally, he's not contractually obligated to use those stories. That's cool, I get that, I understand how the legal of that works. But I have to say, morally, I think you have to make those stories. Or not buy them. Just say, no, we're going to do our own thing, make it very clear from the get-go. Or buy them and specifically make it very clear that you're not going to use them. Specifically purchase them and say, we're purchasing them so that you can't release them. Like, the value that we're getting out of them is so that you can't release them and muddy the water of what we're going to do in the future with the franchise. And make it very clear from the get-go that, no, you no longer own it. We're going to do whatever the hell we want. And that's really the reason that I wanted to talk about it today, is because that attitude of, well, we own it, we're now in control of it, and we're going to do whatever we want, even if it's a fundamental reshaping of the creator's original vision to a twisted and fragmented, point that's far beyond what it originally was. Now, don't get me wrong, I understand the difference between when you get a story that's in one form and you have to change it into another form. It does change the way that the story needs to be told. It can, because of the limitations of that can fundamentally change the way that the story needs to work. So, for instance, in a book, you get access to all 5 senses of a character. If it's written from a first-person perspective, you get smells, you get thoughts, you get, you don't just get your 5 senses. You don't get it felt like this, or it looked like this, or it smelt like this, or all of those things. You get the character's inner thoughts, which is really hard to do. It reminds me of the recent Spider-Man films, right? There was a criticism that in the comic books, a lot of the dialogue that you read is actually Peter Parker's inner thoughts. And it's really hard to do that in a film-like way. And so, in the recent films, they tried to solve that by having an AI in his suit that he talks to, where he can sort of put his own thoughts out there to the audience. I think it's okay. It's an okay mechanism. I don't think it works super great, but that's clearly what they were trying to solve, that problem of, you've got something told one way in a visual medium story, but as soon as it's visual and audio, you can no longer just have a thought bubble pop up. And it's the same in books. So what I'm not arguing for today is that, you have to never change from the source material, and every story has to be exactly 100% the source material, and it can never be done that way. In in rare cases, you can do time jumps and maneuvers. I think the first season of Westworld, I would argue the first season of Westworld didn't do it that well, because I assumed from episode 1 that the man in black was the young guy. I thought that was supposed to be, like, I thought that was so obvious that it had to be a red herring. But that's what happened in the end, and I was so disappointed when that ended up being the big revelation in the climax of, like, oh yeah, it really is him, and it's like, oh well, I saw that coming 7 miles away, but that's why I assumed that wasn't how you were going to do it. I was expecting something more thrilling. Although the more you critique stories and the more that you deconstruct how they're put together, I suppose the more you're going to see those things, and so that, from my perspective, it probably clouds a story that's trying to tell a good story, or trying to be dramatic, or have this big drop. Whatever. I'm way off into the weeds. What I'm not saying is that you can't change from the source material. I think it's fine to change from the source material. It's fine to go in a different direction. I have no problem with Disney making different Star Wars than Lucas if they don't have source material to build from. If they do have source material to build from, which he's admitting that they do have 3 story lines drawn up. I don't know how well fleshed out those are. They're probably just a huge stack of notes. But if you've got 3 movies worth of storylines written out, then you purchase them from the creator, you don't have to tell them like exactly the same. But I do think that if that's the story that he wants to tell going into the future, then I think you should, like I said, legally they're fine, but I think you should try and tell the author's story. And if it's outside of the author's control, if you're outside of canon and you're still in that universe, then yeah, you can tell stories about new characters and you can make, new canon. I think it was a huge mistake to wipe out most of the EU canon, because what we're seeing now is them trying to selectively pick and choose what to bring back in. It seems like Mara Jade is going to be in Star Wars again at some point in the future, which is going to make the story that's happened in the last 2 movies just seem weird, but it fundamentally changes who Luke is if Mara Jade is a character in the universe. Why would he abandon his wife? I don't know, it doesn't matter. Anyway, all of this stuff got me thinking about how when artists sell their work to other mediums, when they sell their intellectual property rights, specifically to movies, but I'm going to talk about The Witcher as well, which is selling property, like intellectual property, to a game developer, how you can really get screwed, and not just financially, but it's your characters that you made, it's your ideas that you've put into form, and to have them twisted and changed outside of your control, I don't know what to think about that. So there are a few other examples outside of this Bob Iger, George Lucas example that I wanted to sort of bring in as background before I talk about it more broadly. So Game of Thrones is a big one that I want to talk about. I don't know how involved George Martin was in the last 3 series of Game of Thrones. Like, that's when they're outside of the book area. He did write whole episodes up to the first 4 seasons, and it definitely seems like he stepped away and he wasn't much of a consultant after those seasons. After those first 4 seasons, it seems like in the seasons when they left the book material, they really began to flounder in the story, and ultimately they ended up... I mean, they have notes from George Martin about how the story is going to end, and so I imagine the story is going to end the way that it did. But I feel like when George does it in the books, it's going to be significantly more satisfying. I feel like things are going to be set up and built up properly, and it's not going to be what the show was, which was just a big jump scare. So, even in that case, where George was an executive producer and he was technically involved in changing from the book medium to the TV show medium, they still, I think, struggled to do it properly, and I think it reflects really badly on George. So a lot of the backlash, people are like, oh, well, George is 70 plus years old, and he's probably never going to finish the books, and this was the only opportunity we were ever going to get to, find out what the end of the story was, and, you shouldn't even bother buying book 6 because he's probably never going to write book 7 because it's taken him this long and all this other crap. And I think what it showed was that D&D are definitely really good at telling people what they want to hear. It seems clear to me that they managed to get the rights. So, like, I've read up on and seen interviews with them about when they talked about, like, getting the rights from George in the first place. Because he hadn't optioned the rights to Game of Thrones. He'd said, no, I don't think anyone can do it well, and I'm not going to sell them off. And D&D went to him, and they, had a chat with him, and they said, oh, who's John's mother? And that was apparently one of the big questions that they answered in their initial conversation that led George to essentially give them the reins of the franchise. Now, I mean, I think that sours in the mouth a little when you realise in the show that it had absolutely no bearing at all on what happens in the climax of the story, that John is the legitimate king does actually change things quite considerably. But in the show that made no difference, even though it was only a plot point when they wanted it to be a plot point. So what I'm saying is I think in the books it will be considerably more important, considering that, George Martin has been setting this up for such a very long, long time that it's going to have more of an impact when it becomes known in the book world that, John is really Aegon Targaryen. So outside of Game of Thrones, the other obvious person to talk about when it talks about intellectual property is Andrzej Sapkowski, who wrote the Witcher series in Poland. I was looking this up to talk about this. So he wrote all these books. I don't know how many, 6 or 7 of them. And then in The Witcher 1 was released in 2007. I don't know when the actual deal was done. But from what I can understand, I mean, I'm converting this from Polish crowns. I don't know what Polish money is in. But from my research, looking it up, he sold it to Metropolis Games. So he sold the right to make a Witcher game to Metropolis Games for approximately $4,000. And then when CD Projekt Red bought Metropolis Games, oh god, I'm running out of mouth, they reacquired the rights and paid another $9,500. So at this point, totally for the rights. And as far as I can tell, the right deal for the intellectual property for The Witcher to make games was a deal done in perpetuity, so CD Projekt Red always, forever, will own the right to make Witcher games, and in that deal, they paid a solid $9,500, and it seems like, especially considering that now there's been Witcher, there was Witcher 1, and then Witcher 2, and Witcher 3, and there's now a Gwent spin-off, which is, Gwent is 100% CD Projekt Red's intellectual property, as far as I understand it, in that they added that to the universe. I don't recall. I've listened to some of the Witcher audiobooks. I've got to get back into them, I guess. But I listened to some of them while I was at work, and I don't recall Gwent ever being a thing in universe in the books. I'm happy to be wrong. Like I said, I haven't read all of them. But anyway, so there was a big thing at the beginning of this year, end of last year, where Andrzej Sapkowski was suing CD Projekt Red because, they made a lot of money off of Witcher 2 and Witcher 3, and they made a good amount of money off of Witcher 1 too. And he was saying, well, I haven't been fairly compensated considering how well it did. But admittedly, in royalty deals like these, then normally you're offered a royalty percentage as well as an upfront payment. So they give you a payment, and then they say, yeah, we'll give you a percentage of the profits if we ever make some. And it seems like Sapkowski had actually argued, because he said in interviews that he didn't think that they would do that well, that a Witcher game wouldn't be that popular. And so he said, well, no, I want you to restructure it so that you give me more money up front, and you can have it in perpetuity forever and ever and ever, and you can, you don't have to pay me a royalty if the game does well. So it's kind of his fault, because he didn't think that they would do a good job. And so at the time of the deal, he thought he was fleecing them, and then it turns out that he was the one being fleeced. In the recent legal action where he sued them and said, can I please have some more money? And it seems like it was more of a contentious, like the way that it was put into the media, it seemed more contentious, because the more I looked into it, the more it seemed like CD Projekt Red had actually tried to make a deal with him before that. A couple of times, I think they'd tried to work out some sort of deal to try and keep things on the level. But it seemed like that had fallen through, or maybe there was a lot of emotion and that was screwing things up. But anyway, from the recent lawsuit, like Andre was suing them for $16 million or something, and it was settled out of court, and as part of that, we don't know what the actual payment was. One imagines it's probably less than $16 million. But, as far as I understand, he's pretty happy with it now. I think CD Projekt Red is pretty happy with it. They've got their own projects to do. I think they're always going to come back and do another Witcher of some description. And hopefully the TV show, which I'm not sure when that's coming out, but hopefully the TV show with Henry Cavill will be good. We'll see. Certainly the TV show is, again, based on the books and not based on the game, because the game deviated in universe a fair way from the books. But I think Andrzej Sapkowski definitely stands out as an example for other writers that maybe they shouldn't, sign away all of their rights. Maybe they should, because normally the way the optioning works is you sign it away for a set period. It's 1 year, it's 5 years, it's 10 years, and you get paid out a lump sum, and then after that time they have to reacquire them from you, or they have to, or the rights go back to you, which is, speaking of, now that we're talking about the rights going back to you, the last author that I want to talk about, it turns out this podcast might be a little bit longer than normal, but the last author that I want to talk about when it comes to this conversation of intellectual property is Patrick Rothfuss, who wrote the Kingkiller Chronicles. Now, he's only written 2 of those books, depending on how you count them. But of the trilogy, he's written In the Name of the Wind and Wise Man's Fear. And I think he's done some short stories and other stuff that I haven't read. I have read The Slow Regard of Silent Things, which is really good. So he's only got 2 of those books done. He'd originally sold off the rights to some company, I don't remember. I couldn't find out which one it was. And then after they lapsed, the rights came back to him, and he was trying to sell them again, because why wouldn't you, really? Patrick Rothfuss is an interesting character, actually. He's done really well on book sales, and he has his own charity that he does that helps to raise money for helping poor areas that are maybe not well educated to get better resources and education, which he does in partnership with Heifer International, I think it is. So I think he was trying to sell the rights to essentially bring more money into the charity that he runs. But I don't know, it doesn't really matter why you want the money. It's fine to want the money for intellectual property just because you want the money. But anyway, so he was courted by a couple of different things. He did a podcast that was relatively short-lived. I think there were 2 seasons, which had a name, but I don't remember what it was. Something, 2 words, funny. But he did a podcast with one of the guys who did Cards Against Humanity, and it was called something. I don't remember what it was. But it was in 2016, during the time that he was reselling the rights, and so we talked about it a couple of times on the podcast. And he talked about them trying to court him, and him basically getting into the mindset of, well, I don't really need the money, and so I'm only going to sell the rights to someone who can prove to me that they can tell the story. And because if you haven't read the Kingkiller Chronicles, it's a very complex story, the way that everything goes together, and you've got a very unreliable narrator telling you things, and it would be very hard, I think, to tell that story visually with all of the extra information and all of the characters that you need to tell the story, because Kvothe does a lot of things. He meets a lot of people and he goes to a lot of places. You need a lot of money for sets. You'd need a lot of different characters to be signed. You need different kinds of uniforms for different areas in, the Commonwealth and the different kingdoms and stuff. And different money in different places. It's a very, very rich and deep world, and it would be really hard to do. And so in that podcast, which is called Unintended Consequences, I think is what it was called. Something like that. Patrick Rothfuss is talking about selling it, and having meetings with these TV executives and movie executive people who are like trying to pitch to him how they're going to do it and who they're going to bring in to help with it and all those sorts of things. And him selling it was based on working with Lin-Manuel Miranda, who's going to do the music for the series, and he stands in stark contrast to Andrzej Sapkowski with The Witcher, in that Andrzej at the time, he sold a few novels, but he definitely needed the money, to live. Whereas Patrick Rothfuss is doing his negotiating from a point of view of, well, I don't really need the money, so if this deal doesn't work, it's not gonna really affect anything. I have the time to not make a deal in order to maybe make a deal in the future that's more likely to tell the story properly, rather than twist it in order to try and tell a bad portion of it. Anyway, with that background, it's got me thinking about what would happen if anyone ever offered me to buy the TV options to any of my stories. Now, admittedly, it's probably never going to happen. It's not like I have that much of a backlog written up so far, and everything that I've written is such short stuff that, no one would want it for anything unless they were doing a skit show or, something very, very small. But let's say when novels, let's say, that Frank Mason takes off and someone wants to buy it to do a TV show or whatever. I find myself thinking about sort of how I would deal with that, because right now I think I would rather have the money than worry too much about what they might do. I mean, even in the case of, so if you look at the Dresden Files, right? I discovered the Dresden Files because of the show. And then when I read the book, I was like, oh my god, the book's so much better than the show was. The show was good enough. The premise, you can't really change the premise between the show and the book. The premise is going to be the same, even if they execute it poorly. And so, seeing the premise of the show and being like, oh, it's based on these books by some guy called Jim Butcher, and then going and buying them. I bought the first one, and then I bought the remaining. There were only 11 out at the time. And I read all of 11 books in the first, in a month. So in that case, the TV show, no matter what form it is or how, well done it is, does act as a way of getting more people to read the books. And definitely that can be said with Game of Thrones. Way more people have read the books because it was turned into a show. It can definitely be said about the Witcher series. Way more people have read the books because of the game. This kind of deal, no matter how well it's executed, can introduce a new portion of audience to your work, and there's definitely value in that, even if they absolutely, muck up everything about the new format that they're trying to tell your story in. So there's sort of, it plays in my mind, sort of going back and forth of I kind of want to have creative control, or at least I want it to be a story told well. But, at the moment, if someone was like, oh, hey, we'll give you some cash, and that'll mean that you can work fewer days at work and you can focus more on writing and help to build a bigger platform than you have now, then I honestly don't think I could say no. There are many, many authors in the world who pay their bills off of TV options because that's where the bulk of their money actually comes from. Even though those stories are never actually made into films or TV shows. That's the secret of, I don't even know if it's a secret, but that's the kind of thing that happens with a big market like Hollywood, is they buy up everything even if they never actually make any of it. And in a lot of cases they're buying up stuff just so that their opponents don't have access to those stories. And that's happened in the straight up novel writing world. It's happened at, there are reports of people at Comic-Con just basically going booth to booth, just buying, just doing deals the whole way down, just to cut off, their opponents. Netflix gobbled up all of these, intellectual property rights to make all of these stories, even though they'll never make, maybe even, a sort of percentage of them. But if they own them, then Hulu can't own them, and then Hulu they've got to come up with their own new ideas and that sort of stuff. So it could definitely be a huge lifeline, especially for a younger author. And I don't begrudge Andrzej Sapkowski for taking that small deal at the time, because if you offered me 10 grand right now, I would be like, hey, if you give me 10 grand, I can afford to take a day off a week from work. That would completely cover a day a week from work, and I can then devote that one day a week to just doing more writing, and hopefully by the end of the year, that'll mean that I can maybe sustain that, maybe by being able to spend the extra time on it. So it's hard to begrudge anyone, to do the deal, but at the same time, I feel really sad for people. No, I don't feel so bad for Andrzej Sapkowski, really. The change in the character of The Witcher, Geralt is pretty much the same. They have changed some of the world lore and things in the games, but they haven't changed that much. Magic works a little bit differently, I think. But when they're telling their own story, and you don't need to worry about a lot of that. With stories like Game of Thrones, where it's a fundamental change, it's not just a shift in they've changed the way that characters move and the way that they would act. The last 3 seasons, the characters don't act the same as the characters in the first season. And the very last season, I think my biggest criticism was that it seemed like they'd erased 6 seasons of character development, and that the characters seemed to behave exactly the way they would have in season 1, rather than the way that they should be acting after season 4. like, things have happened to those characters and they should change the way that they're going to act, and one imagines that that would make a difference. But I mean, ultimately, I don't think I'm ever going to come to a fixed position on this. It definitely depends on your personal circumstances. If you need to make a sale in order to live, then you got to take what you can get. On the other hand, and definitely, especially in that case of where, they've got all of the power and you're, not that well known an artist, pushing too much in the deal to, look for rights further on, or to have it, maybe not be in perpetuity, maybe to have it run out after a period, and have the rights revert to you. Having those sorts of things added into a deal can be enough to break the deal, and you might not have another option elsewhere to go to. So there's an element of you have to take what you can get, but there's also an element of you created those characters, you created that world, you also have a responsibility to your audience to make sure that if the story is retold, like to your core audience, to make sure that if the story is retold, that they're actually telling the story that people know. I mean, that's the point of buying these books, right? You buy a book that already comes with a pre-made audience, right? That's why Disney bought Star Wars, right? Disney bought Star Wars because it's this massive money-making machine. All they have to do is slap Star Wars on the face of a movie. They can tell any story they want, and it's gonna get a bunch of people going to watch it. Now, the one thing that they've learnt recently is you can still bugger that up, right? They learnt with Solo, they spent too much money, they made a bad story. When people went and watched it, they went, this isn't a good story, I don't want anything to do with it. And, it didn't make as much money as what they spent on making it. They didn't make any new iconic characters to make new toy sales that are generated from just that story. And they, ruined a lot of canon, and it turns out Star Wars fans can only take so much before they won't go and see your bad movies anymore. So, hopefully Disney has learned their lesson, but honestly, they're still talking about, Star Wars fatigue, and it's like, no, it's not Star Wars fatigue. If you put out a good movie that's a good Star Wars movie, I will go and watch one every week. But if you put out a bad movie every year, people are going to get sick of it. Anyway, I'm off in the weeds, and I'm already at many, many minutes over the sort of half an hour time frame that I try to aim for in the podcast. So, wrapping up the main topic, I really don't have any hard and fast rules, or, it's just a collection of random thoughts of you go for it or don't go for it, and ultimately it's impossible to know all of the factors that are going to, solve the problems of your deals. If you can sell the things to a market, even if they do it badly, it can mean better sales or better knowledge of you as an artist, and that can be worth doing it even if the deal is bad. On the other hand, looking after your intellectual property and leaving a legacy is, one of the reasons why I write. When I write something, the stories that I put up, I'm never going to be as famous as Shakespeare or Chaucer, but Chaucer was writing in the 1300s, 700 years ago, we still know about him. It's definitely a possibility that I could write something that someone in the future after I have perished will read, and I will continue to live on in their mind after I'm gone. The ability to do that with writing is one of the reasons that I write. So I don't know that I want to give that necessarily up for a short-term paycheck either. That said, I don't know that bad adaptations of movies or TV shows hurt an author's legacy in the long term. Robert Ludlum's stories, The Bourne Identity. The Bourne Identity is a fantastic book, and the sequels to it, Ultimatum and Supremacy. I don't remember which order they were in. They were not as good as the first, but reasonably good books. The 1980s BBC 6-part short series of The Bourne Identity was fantastic. I think it had Roger Moore in it, or Robert Redford. I don't know, one of those people. I remember catching it at some point, and it was great. And when they talked about doing the movies with Matt Damon, I was like, I like Matt Damon, this is going to be great. And then I watched the movie and I was like, what have you done? The antagonist, who is throughout all 3 of the books, is not in the movie. And the antagonist is the prime reason for the creation of the alias that becomes Jason Bourne. So it kind of just, other than having a character with the same name, you're telling a completely different story. And they made, I don't know how many movies about this, and when they got rid of, I think Matt Damon didn't want to do them anymore, but, when they replaced him with Jeremy Renner, they started telling an entirely different story. But I don't think that reflects badly on Robert Ludlum. I don't think anyone will remember the bad story adaptations over time. I think they only remember it in the short term. So that's another argument in the you should take whatever you can get column. Anyway, I'm going pretty long, so let's move on to talking about next week's work. So my story for next Tuesday will be based on the prompt Artificial Womb Law. We'll see how that goes. On Wednesday, I'm going to review the TV show The Rookie with Nathan Fillion. I completely missed this coming out last year. The whole season is out. I've been watching the whole season the last couple of days, and it's fantastic. So I will finish watching everything up to date and do a review of it next Wednesday. On Thursday, the story will be written from the prompt Time Travel Recruitment. And the topic for next week's podcast is Only the Chosen One Can Save Us. And I promise I've been deviating a lot from this week I deviated a fair bit. I promise next week these are the things that I will do. So you can look forward to those. If you want to send me a message or ask me a question, you can contact me at contact@robert-lynch.com or on Twitter at BobLynchBSC. If you like what I'm doing and you want to help me to make more of it, then you can check out my Patreon at patreon.com/RobertLynch. As always, check out my website for new stuff every weekday, and I will see you next week.